Great. So welcome everyone to my presentation. Thank you, Burak, for a nice introduction. Yeah, I'm going to present a project which we are working on with two of my co-workers, Fabian and Kalleitner, who is also working at the same department like I do at the University of Vienna, and Licia Bobzien, who is working in Heritage School of Governance in Berlin. So, as Burak already mentioned, our title is Learning to be Taxed Fairly, Preferences for Redistributive Taxation and Status Quo Bias. So starting at the really beginning, so why is it important to understand redistributive taxation, and what do we know about the preferences, what we build about redistributive taxation? So according to Meltzer-Richard model, preferences for redistribution can be explained by the income inequality. That means that by rising income inequality, according to the Meltzer-Richard model, also the preferences for redistribution should increase. However, if we are taking a look back in time, in the history, we can see that actually, over the time, an increase in the tax rate occurred only like after the world wars, and since then it stays constant or a little bit declining sometimes, which is not in line with the actual situation that inequality arise. So therefore we were asking ourselves, how could we explain the stability of the preference of redistribution? So we took a closer look at the Meltzer and Richard model in the extended version, in which Meltzer and Richard explained that income inequality influences the perception about inequality. So if income inequality increasing, then we are perceiving inequality also more. And Meltzer and Richard, assuming or interpreting this path from a perceived inequality to evaluation to inequality is a negative path, meaning that the higher we perceive inequality, the more or the less do we like it. So therefore, we are preferring higher redistribution. However, in the study or in the research of Hing et al., he emphasized the relevance that this path is not necessarily negative, because Meltzer and Richard assumes that people are subjectively perceive more income inequality, what they will evaluate it less positively. However, this is not always the case, because sometimes people are perceive this kind of inequality. They perceive it and try to rationalize it and justify it due to the process of legitimization. So therefore, we want to focus on this important aspect, the legitimacy of inequality and redistribution, rather than focusing on the amount of inequality, in order to understand the demand for redistributive taxation. So as a central mechanism, we analyze the adoption process, the adoption process in order to understand what do we perceive as fair, as just. So we discuss potential mechanisms such as numerical anchoring, that is the tendency that humans are likely to anchor in estimates which are based on recent and frequent circumstances and situations. The second is system justification. That means that people try to process new information in favor to interpret it as for their well-being, to avoid psychological discomfort. So they try to explain it in a positive way why they are in the situation or in the system. And last but not least, the normative embedding. So market societies are normatively and institutionally embedded, which tends to strengthen our argument, and they are in line with this argument of status quo. And therefore, this issue relates to a normative context as well, as information might moderate one's assessments. So therefore, that's our approach is to explain tax preferences with the status quo taxation in the system what we are living in, over the mediating role of fair taxation, what we perceive as fair. So what we know already about status quo in terms of redistribution is that it affects individuals what they consider to be a fair amount of inequality. So recent empirical study found that if they give information about inequality, it legitimize the level of inequality what we are living in. Additionally, it's been also found that status quo affects what people consider to be fair process of generating inequality. That means that if people know that the original endowment was unequal, they are more likely to accept it. So why do we focus on taxation? Because the Meltzer-Richard model focuses on redistribution by transfer, and which are determined by the size of the government. However, redistribution has two dimensions: the who gives and who gains. So as varying the redistribution by transfers, these two aspects, who gives and who gains, are melting a little bit together. And several studies already have shown that preferences for redistribution and taxation and benefits are not necessarily in line with each other, so they do not necessarily have to be aligned. Additionally, forthcoming research investigates that redistribution from and redistribution to also highlight two different fairness frames in two different groups, like the rich who is redistributing to the poor. And therefore, we are adapting the Meltzer-Richard model as fixing the size of the government. And we are focusing on the distribution of the costs. So we are investigating on mostly on the aspect of who gives, so the redistribution from aspect. In order to do so, we are having a three-step approach. First, we have observational data from surveys in order to gain external validity. Is it really the case out of the world? Is it that what we are experiencing? Is it what really people sticking to the status quo? Secondly, we conducted a survey experiment where we investigated whether information about the structure of the tax burden really lead to people to adapt their just tax estimate to the status quo. And last but not least, we also are going to run a laboratory experiment, hopefully next week, where we really want to see whether this kind of adoption happens also in behavior in an incentivized setting. So starting with our observational data, we used the Social European Survey in 2018, where we have 25 countries without Bulgaria, Cyprus, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And we are, because we are focusing on taxation, we are focusing on self-employed and employed people. We deleted the missing values list-wise, and we ended up with 12,158 individuals from, as I mentioned, 25 countries. And in order to understand what we measure, I show you the survey questions. So first of all, we asked them to estimate their monthly gross pay before taxation. And then afterwards, we asked them to enter the monthly net pay after taxation. So we asked them what they are earning gross and net, basically. Afterwards, we asked them to evaluate whether they think that, that this kind of gross payment and net payment is unfairly low, fair, or unfairly high. So here you can see a niner Likert scale. In the middle, if they tipped 0, then it meant that they are thinking that their payment is fair. However, if they thought that it's extremely unfair or slightly unfair, low paid or high paid on the other side, then we asked a further question, namely, in their opinion, what would be a fair level of monthly gross payment and net payment. So based on the third question, and based on the data, what we call those who said that they have fair payments based on their actual payment or stated payment, we calculated the fair tax shares. So this tax, we defined that this tax share is the total tax and the social security burdens of individuals' gross, and it's the gross income net of the potential deductions. And exactly, so this what we calculated, this measure, its distribution is really similar to the distribution of a direct question about tax fairness, what was used in the pre-analysis of the ESS. So we dropped cases that indicated that some people have a higher net income than gross income, and also the drop cases where the more than 61% of the income are taxes. And here you can see our results. You can see the different countries and their share of gross income, what they perceive, what they're really experiencing, what is taxed, and what they think it's a fair tax. So what we can learn from this graphic is that it's always a little bit less over the countries, and the variation is really strong between the countries. So also to be able to, which is in line with our argument, actually. So in order to create multi-level regressions, we calculated two macro level indicators: the average tax in a country, which is the average rate of income tax and employee social security contribution of a single person at 100% of average earnings without children. And additionally, we calculated the progressivity index for each country. Namely, this is we took the difference between high earning groups whose has 167 of average earnings, and low earnings groups, so single person at 67% of average earnings. And then we adapted these earnings to the household structure. Here you can see our results. So on the left-hand side, you can see the average tax in the countries. And as you can see, countries with lower average tax perceive also, they perceive a lower level of tax as fair. Compared to countries with a higher level of average taxation, they are perceiving also a higher level of taxation as fair. And on the right-hand side, using the progressivity index, we checked out whether how it differs over the different income groups within a country. So in the progressivity index on the x-axis, you can see that in 0, meaning that there are really low level of progressivity, also the difference of the different income groups, what they perceive as a fair tax is really low. Meaning that they are experiencing almost the same level of taxes, and also the income groups, there is not that big difference between the perception of income groups. In contrast to countries who have a really high progressivity level, and in this case, there is a higher difference of perceived taxes between the income groups. So lower tax groups perceive lower income groups perceive lower tax as fair, and higher groups as higher taxes. So after gaining an external validity of our argument, we used a survey experiment. As I mentioned before, we wanted to investigate how information and disinformation about the structure of the tax burden lead people to adopt their just tax estimate to the status quo. So we conducted the survey experiment. It was an online experiment, and there were 1,088 participants. We conducted it in Austria in 2018 with the cooperation of Statistics Austria and Puma. So here you can see our design for the survey experiment. We asked people what they think about what the perceived tax rate, that means what they think that's the actual tax rates in the country, in Austria. And then we treated them with information about the actual tax rates. So we told them what we experienced, what they think it is, and then we told them what it is. And we had also a control group who did not get any information about it. And afterwards, they had to estimate what they think is a fair tax rate. So here we can see the question wording. As I mentioned, first we asked how much do you guess a person with the following average monthly gross income levels pays in total on the tax and dues, and then we asked 4 different income earnings, like for income of 1,200 euros pays some percentage, and 2,200, 3,200, 6,000 euros. And then afterwards, those who belong to the information treatment, we gave them the information based on calculations. What is that a person gross income of about 1,200 euros had an average tax share about 29%. You answered X%. So we showed them what's the actual one and what they answered. And also we did it for all the 4 earnings. And after we treated them with information or not, we asked what they perceive, which percentage they perceive as just, think as just. For 1,200 euro monthly gross income, they had to estimate what they think would be just on taxes and dues. And also again for all the 4 income categories. And to make it similar to the ESS as possible, we I always issues with it, operationalize the individual fair tax burden to the closest income group. So if someone had 1,300 euros, then we took the percentage for 1,200 euros, what he estimated. And here you can see our results for the survey experiment. We separated, or we made 3 groups, namely those who correctly estimated the actual tax burden, who overestimated it, and those who underestimated it. And we also differentiate between those who didn't get the treatment, who was not informed about the actual one, and those who get informed what is the actual tax rate. And you can see in those who correctly answered the tax burden, so they had an idea, there is no statistical significance that the 2 treatments would, that the treatment group would differ from the control group. So they have really similar values, what they perceive as fair taxation, in contrast to those who underestimated the tax burden. Because as you can see, who didn't get information about it, they also and underestimated the tax burden. They also perceive taxation in a lower level as just, compared to those who get the information what is the actual. So the status quo is what is the actual tax share in the case. This difference is also significant. This is not the case in there. You can also see a pattern in the overestimated tax burden, so that those who overestimated and those who get an information, there's a slight difference. However, it's not this significant because most of the people underestimated the tax rates, and that you can also see in the correct tax burdens. And cool is also that this argument holds for each income group. So we control for possible moderation by income. So you can see the same pattern in low income earner groups, middle income earner groups, and also in the case of high income groups, namely that those who are paying already many taxes but overestimated what they're paying actually, and get the information, they perceive even more taxes as just, even though it's completely irrational. So coming to the laboratory experiment, as I mentioned, we would like to test it also in an incentivized setting, whether the status quo taxation affect fairness considerations and individual tax preferences. And therefore, we assume a model of redistribution that builds on a simplified version of the tax system described in Kansunar 2020 and Luan Shivi in 2016. And we also account for the variation in distribution of costs. And instead, what Meltzer and Richard model is doing, we are fixing the size of the government. So we keep it as constant, the transfers. However, we are varying the structure of the tax. So either it's a flat tax or a progressive tax. And furthermore, we define redistribution similarly to the Metzger-Richard model as a lump sum redistribution. And we also set a minimal cost of taxation. We do it in order to avoid that the median voter have the same earnings before and after the taxation. So here you can see the utility of an individual. It is nothing else than the gross income, basically, minus the taxed difference between the gross income and the average. And based on this utility function, we have three hypotheses. The first one is that, that low-income groups, those who are below the average, will prefer high level of progressivity, high level of tax shares. Individuals who have average earnings are indifferent, and individuals who are above the average income would prefer minimum of tax shares, so flat taxes, basically. In order to test our exactly, and we incorporating also the status quo bias. So exactly based what happened in the last period and what is going to, or what's happening in the period that we are observing. So in order to test our hypothesis, we have an experiment design, 1x2 experiment design. At the beginning, each player are playing 2 rounds of real effort tasks. They have to count small and big letters in order to earn money. So based on their performance and based on their result, we rank them into 5 different inequality groups. So low, second low, middle, second high. And we match them into groups. So in each group, there are 5 different income groups, basically. So in each group, there are 5 people, and each of the 5 people belong to different income earnings groups. And what they earned is actually their gross income. So after they are experiencing that which income group they belong and how much their gross income is, we treat them. So how do we treat them? We gave them a status quo taxation, basically. Once we tax them in a flat tax rate, like a low tax redistribution, once we tax them in progressive redistribution and high tax rate, and in order to control for the status quo, we also have a treatment without any status quo where they can immediately vote after they are experiencing their gross income. So in the treated groups and also in the control group, after they are experiencing their redistribution based on the tax share rate, they can vote what they would actually prefer. So how between 0 and 100. 100 is for high progressivity and 0 is for flat tax, basically. And based on the voting afterwards, that's how we are measuring fairness. So here you can see a screenshot of the experiment. As you, this is the high progressivity treatment. As you can see, each people can, as they are voting, this is the voting screen, and each people as they are voting, they can see also what happened before. So they see what they were actually earned, so what was their gross income. They also see what they have to pay for taxes. They also see the transfers, which, as I mentioned before, we are holding constant. And summing it up, they see their net income. And below in the graphic, they can see the percentage, how much taxes they paid in relation to their gross income. So this is a high progressive taxation. And it's also, as I mentioned before, in the game, it's defined as 100. So before they are voting, they can calculate any tax share rates between 0 and 100. So for example, if they would enter 0, then they would see, okay, I have to pay taxes, half of my money, like everyone else do. Exactly. So basically what we are doing here is to explain tax preferences by the status quo tax distribution over the mediating role of fairness. So what do we understand by fairness? Because I didn't mention it till now. So we have 3 different approaches to measure fairness. The first one is the fairness of net income inequality. That means that before after they voted, but before they experienced their outcome, we asked them what distribution of income would you consider to be fair. That's the first one. The second approach is to fairness of the outcome. So after they experience the outcome, we ask them, do you think this is it fair? And last but not least, before they experience the outcome, we also let them play a small spectator game where they have to judge or judge a fairness, judge a tax share, so estimate a tax share, which is going to have a consequence of another group, other group's earnings. So it has a monetary consequence for the others, but not to their own group, but for another group. And that's how we are measuring fairness as a social preference, which is inspired by this spectator framework from Kaplan et al. So coming to the end, our preliminary findings are two important points. First of all, that different income earners in different countries have different perception and views about the fair tax share. So what they perceive as just and fair, which is in line with the tax system in the place where they are living in and in the income group where they belong to. Second, information about the current tax system, what we learned from the second study, leads people to adopt a perception about the fair tax towards to the status quo. And further implications are that institution, the power of the institution is really strong as determining and limiting the preferences of others. And additionally, as I mentioned, we observed that mostly people are underestimate what they are paying for taxes. So information might lower demands for redistributive taxation, actually. And last but not least, we think that it's important sometimes to study phenomena which are stable, so stably not changing that much, rather than study phenomena which are variable or changing all the time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Réka. It was fantastic. So actually, we finished before even the 40 past, so we got more time for the Q&A as well. That's great. So, but before the Q&A, of course, we're going to have the discussion by Klarita. If she's ready, I think we could start with a discussion. Klarita, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
All right, thank you, Burak. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Wonderful. So thank you, and thanks to you, both you and Szendrö, for inviting me to this very interesting initiative and very important one. As you said, we need to have more of this within sociology. We need to establish our own platform. So let's keep this going. Let's keep the ball rolling. I also enjoyed very much reading the extended abstract of Fabian, Licia, and Réka, if I pronounce it well. I should actually emphasize the fact that I only got an extended abstract, and I see now that you actually have the work much more involved than the extended abstract gives credit to it. So my comments will be based on that abstract that I got, or that piece that I got. And before I share the slides, one more final announcement. I apologize beforehand for these very full slides that you'll be seeing, but my experience online is that people don't see each other's faces, so they follow the slides. So I'd rather have the slides clear. All right, so bear with me and apologize for that. So let me share. I am assuming that you're seeing it all. All right, so again, happy to be part of this and discuss it. Now, Réka had quite some time to explain her work and what they've been doing, and yet, for the sake of the fact that I want to be on the same page in how I understood the piece that I saw, I will provide a brief summary. So then you see how I understood it, but also for the ones that maybe miss some things, they can see in a nutshell what their research is about. So the point of departure is the economic model of Melton and Richard, and it's pretty straightforward. So what they say is individuals prefer redistribution if they gain from it, and they oppose redistribution if they pay for it. It's pretty clear. Now, in this environment, that's what the paper argues, is that one would expect that increased inequality would lead to stronger demand for distribution. And yet, right, and yet there seems to be some empirical puzzle here, because the demand for redistribution does not seem to be higher when inequality is higher, as you would expect it, right, from the theory. Therefore, the paper asks whether this could be related to findings that some inequality might be considered fair. And then if I quote what they exactly say, literally what they say is that they focus on the question whether changing inequality leads individuals to adjust their preferences to their fairness and legitimacy concerns. All right, now what do they introduce? So what's new here, at least the way, I mean, theoretically at least. So what they argue is that fairness perceptions are strongly affected by the status quo. So the perceived current situation determines what is conceived to be fair. And what they aim to do is to disentangle and test the link between three aspects. So the current income tax system, which is their measure of inequality, the ideas about fairness, and the preferences regarding redistribution. And they aim to do that by combining three studies, or what they call three steps. One is a cross-country analysis observational data. One is a survey experiment in Austria. And the third is a laboratory experiment with a real effort task. All right, so this is how I understood the research. Now let me first give some general comments, and then I will be more specific for each study in particular. So this is no doubt a very interesting project. There is a clear underlying idea saying that preferences for redistribution are affected by current situation, meaning that if there is much inequality, then there is less demand for redistribution. And I strongly support and like the idea of combining observational data with not only controlled, I have here controlled laboratory data, but also field data with a survey experiment. However, some more motivation is needed, especially in explaining why status quo would affect fairness considerations. In the piece that I read, the authors argue that this is because of legitimization, and that's what also Réka said. And yet you're left wondering, why exactly would someone that would be harmed by reconfirming or accepting this inequality would find it legitimate to accept this, right? So, and how does this work? And then through Réka's presentation, I had the feeling she was talking about adaptation more than legitimization, unless that's the same thing, but that's unclear, right? And then if it is adaptation, is it more a question of habit formation than legitimization? Well, in any case, this needs to be clarified, because one is left wondering really whether it's legitimization that is explaining this. Another issue that needs to be addressed, recognized, but preferably addressed, though that can be taken care of in the experiment, is the reverse causality, or the possibility of a reverse causality. Basically, people who prefer inequality may actually vote for parties that propose little redistribution. So this is the alternative way. So you're saying people have inequality or experience inequality, accept it, and therefore find it fair, while one could argue that's the other way around. Another issue is, how do you define the status quo? Is it the progressivity of the tax system? Is it the mean tax, or is it the relative level of income versus wealth tax? Again, you may have it already clear, so ignore it if this is simply because it wasn't clear in that piece. Now, let me go into detail some modest thoughts on each study. So study one, your hypothesis indeed, so you need to reconsider this issue of causality problem I mentioned earlier, because your hypothesis seems to suffer from that. Also, you define perceived fair tax is the difference between perceived fair level of gross income and perceived fair level of net income. And to me, this gives an individual measure of fair tax. This is fine, and yet I wonder how you go from micro to macro level. In the piece, you were arguing that what you are actually contributing with here is that compared to the classical model in economics is the link between micro and macro. And I wonder whether this measure allows you to do that. But maybe I missed it. Because a mean fair level does not say anything about preferred tax progressivity. And I wonder whether you distinguish between those who would benefit from distribution and those who would not. From the data that I saw in that piece, you seem to indicate that you look at the variance in perceived fair income and at the difference between rich and poor. And this is not only the data, but this distinction of classes, income classes, also is reflected in your second hypothesis. And both, so these choices of looking at the variance, but also the distinction between rich and poor or income classes needs to be motivated. So you seem to expect some difference there, but there is no discussion of that. So you have to motivate. And yes, again, you may have it, but I didn't see it. The specification of your multi-level model would have helped to understand what you're doing here. All right, some thoughts on study 2, the survey experiment in Austria. So the surveys or the experiment aims to do is to measure people's estimation, at least the way I understand it. It aims to measure people's estimation of the tax burden to see how well informed they are. Then you test whether providing information about the actual level affects their opinions about the fair level of the tax burden. It is not clear to me how the tax burden is measured. So is it the mean, is it the progression? And I was also wondering if people do adapt to information. Could there be another reason and not because they find it fair? And here is an example. Apologize for this bunch of text, but that's just so that we follow each other. Assume a respondent knows the current level of public services like infrastructure, and she's simply liking it and she's satisfied, she wants to keep this level. But then she learns that higher taxes are needed to provide this infrastructure than she originally thought. So in this case, she might adjust her fair tax level, but not because of inequality or redistribution, but simply because she likes it and she wants to keep the same level, right? So how can you distinguish this mechanism from the mechanism you are proposing? And then study 3, your laboratory experiment, which I find quite the most innovative in many ways. Here are some questions. There wasn't much information in that extended abstract, so I'll go with what I read. You are planning to use a real effort task, which, I mean, there are many good reasons for using a real effort task, although you do need to justify why a real effort task, so to motivate it. But there is one possible complication. Earning money via real effort is known to give a sense of entitlement to the earnings. So it is quite possible that the redistribution preferences depend on this entitlement. Then the question is whether preferences in the entitlement case are what you want to measure. Maybe they are. I just wanted to point out that there is this element of entitlement, and you may want to have a brief discussion on that in the paper. And finally, I added this last line while you were presenting, because you seem to say that the main mechanism that you are proposing here that is having this effect is legitimacy. And I wonder with the experiment that you are doing, whether you capture legitimacy really, right? So what is legitimacy exactly? Coming back to that discussion we had earlier, right? The adoption adaptation or habit formation. And does the experiment really allow you to capture legitimacy? Unless you're saying That's not my goal or our goal. We're simply saying that this is the theoretical mechanism, and it's not our goal to capture it or to measure it. It's just that we argue it's there. But if that's your main contribution, then you may want to clarify whether and how you do it. And to conclude, I mean, this is an impression I got from reading your piece, that you argue that others have looked at this same issue. So in a way, you wonder while reading the piece, like, okay, but what exactly is the added value? So what's novel here? If the others have done it, the others have also, so I've looked at it experimentally, I've also argued that legitimacy is the underlying mechanism. So you seem to be doing the same. I understand there's the novelty of combining these three studies, but if that's the novelty, and then you want to really make that clear and show why that is a novel, not in the sense of what's the added value of that. So that's a novelty because it's not done, that's one thing, but what we learn from doing that beyond what we already know, it needs to become clearer and stronger. And that only it does justice to what you're doing and makes your contribution clear to the world out there. Well, thank you, I really enjoyed reading it.